Top 10 Disappointments in UFC History. After shocking the world and knocking out Aljamain Sterling to become the UFC Bantamweight Champion, Sean O'Malley proved to the world that the hype was most definitely real. However, things rarely go according to plans, and the UFC has seen a ton of hype trains crash and burn in their 30-year history. We're counting down the top 10 biggest disappointments in UFC history. 10. Crone Gracie. Bearing the weight of the illustrious Gracie legacy, expectations for Crone were towering as he stepped into the UFC. His jiu-jitsu mastery was on full display when he tangled with Alex Caceres, leaving fans eager for more. However, the complexities of MMA became evident when he met seasoned fighters. The bout with Cub Swanson was particularly telling. Despite Crone's grappling pedigree, Swanson dominated the fight and didn't even let it go to the ground. And after a long layoff, things got worse when Crone returned to the octagon this year to face Charles Jourdain. Crone seemed uninterested in even trying to stand with Jourdain and butt-scooted his way to one of the most embarrassing decision losses in recent memory. After losing his last 2 UFC fights in such ugly fashion, it's hard to believe Crone has any future at all in MMA. 9. Paige VanZant. With the right blend of charisma, tenacity, and undeniable good looks, Paige VanZant was quickly pegged as a rising star in the MMA world. After knocking out Bec Rawlings with a beautiful jumping switch kick, she was fast-tracked down the path towards title contention. However, the road ahead was fraught with challenges. Injuries plagued her progression. As the tests got tougher, VanZant was unable to rise to the occasion. A number of bad losses spotlighted just how large the gap was between her and the strawweight elites, and her inability to close the gap led to her being cut from the UFC. Paige transitioned to bare-knuckle boxing for a fresh start, but success has continued to falter there as well. But don't worry, even though she's completely forgotten how to fight, she's thriving in the world of OnlyFans. 8. Takanori Gomi. Japanese MMA legend Takanori the Fireball Kid Gomi was one of the most powerful and relentless boxers that Pride ever saw. After the dissolution of Pride in 2007, UFC fans were dying to see the Fireball Kid light up the UFC octagon. Unfortunately, the sparks never flew for the Japanese boxer. Whether he was just past his prime or the competition was that much stronger in America, Gomi just couldn't replicate his Pride success against top-tier UFC lightweights. And after fighters like Nate Diaz and Kenny Florian highlighted his grappling shortcomings, opponents opted to exploit his ground game and never even gave him a chance to strike with them. As the losses mounted, it became clear Gomi's flame, which once burned bright in Pride, was merely a flicker in the UFC. 7. Sage Northcut. Bursting onto the UFC scene, Sage Northcut brought with him not just his impeccable karate skills, but also a charisma that made him instantly marketable. His early successes against fighters like Cody Pfister and Enrique Marin only amped up the buzz. But as the level of competition ramped up, cracks in his armor became evident. Clashes with the likes of Mickey Gall and Brian Barberena showcased his vulnerabilities, suggesting that perhaps the UFC spotlight shone on him a tad prematurely. While his star quality was undeniable, Sage's readiness for the UFC's elite proved to be overestimated. However, while he did flare out quickly in the UFC, Sage has begun a comeback in ONE FC. And after winning his most recent fight with a beautiful leg lock, maybe he's got another run in him. 6. Khadis Ibragimov. Hailing from Dagestan, undefeated M1 light heavyweight champion Khadis Ibragimov marched into the UFC carrying the weight of immense expectations. Following in the footsteps of fellow Dagestani standouts Habib Nurmagomedov and Zabit Magomed-Shapirov, Khadis was expected to be the next great talent out of the region. However, encounters with the likes of Da Un Jung, Ed Herman, and Roman Dolidze, the man brought in to end the reign of John Jones, found himself drowning in a sea of light heavyweight sharks and was unable to win a single fight in the UFC octagon. After going 0 for 4 in the promotion, he quietly returned to Russia, where he has resumed his hobby of crushing cans and avoiding difficult fights. 5. Michael Chandler. Before he even stepped foot inside the UFC octagon, Michael Chandler was touted as arguably the biggest signing in the promotion's history. Of course, he was more than willing to take on that title. However, when the level of hype is that high, it's pretty hard to live up to the expectations. His background as a multiple-time Bellator champion allowed him to walk right into lightweight contention, and when he knocked out Dan Hooker in his debut, he had a lot of us convinced he was heir apparent to Khabib Nurmagomedov. But after stumbling in his title shot versus Charles Oliveira, then going on to lose 2 of his next 3 fights, the hype has definitely worn off and left a lot of fans feeling like they were sold a much different product than the one they received. And while you can't argue against Chandler being one of the most entertaining fighters of the last few years, he is most definitely not the future champion many expected. 4. Darren Till. When Darren Till arrived in the UFC, he was the young and exciting contender British MMA fans had been waiting for. And after impressively beating Cowboy Cerrone and Wonderboy Thompson, the undefeated Scouser was fast-tracked to a title shot. However, when he faced Tyron Woodley for the belt, he was violently fraud-checked. Woodley showed that Darren Till was nowhere near championship caliber, snatching his 0 and pretty much ending his career. In his next fight, he was brutally knocked out by George Masvidal in front of his home crowd in London, and just like that, his run at welterweight was over. A move up to middleweight seemed to make sense at the time, but after winning his debut at 185 via split decision over Kelvin Gastelum, Till went on to lose his next 3 fights in pretty ugly fashion. Till was 17-0 when he fought for the belt back in 2018, and since then he's racked up 5 losses, only 1 win, and subsequently retired from the sport. 3. Ben Askren. While he may not look like a world-class athlete, Ben Askren has one of the most impressive wrestling resumes in MMA history. He entered the UFC undefeated, having won the Bellator and ONE FC welterweight titles without taking much damage at all. To make expectations even higher, he was traded from ONE FC to the UFC in exchange for no other than Demetrius Johnson. The unique trade amplified the expectations astronomically, and things never got easier. His UFC journey began with a controversial win over fan favorite Robbie Lawler, and it included one of the strangest stoppages in recent memory. However, the tides turned dramatically when he wound up on the wrong end of the most famous knockout in the history of the sport. George Masvidal's 5-second flying knee knockout, the fastest in UFC history, shattered any veneer of invincibility Askren might have had and made famous for all the wrong reasons. His narrative took another hit with a submission loss to Damian Maia, and just like that, 3 fights destroyed one of the strongest legacies in mixed martial arts. Then he got knocked out by Jake Paul in his return to combat sports, and just like that, he went from one of the most hyped prospects to the laughingstock of the sport. 2. Merco Cro Cop. In his Pride days, Merco Cro Cop was an absolute nightmare for his opponents, with one of the most lethal left high kicks the world has ever seen. So when rumors began to circulate that he was joining the UFC, the MMA world was buzzing with anticipation. But in just his second fight inside the octagon, Cro Cop ironically found himself on the receiving end of a nasty head kick from Gabriel Gonzaga. And though his UFC career wasn't as disastrous as some of the other fighters on this list, the expectations placed upon him as a result of his dominance and pride made his lack of success even more disappointing. He was inconsistent to say the least and never dominated the way Pride fans expected him to. After going a 3-fight losing streak, he was rightfully cut from the promotion, ending one of the most disappointing runs in the early history of the UFC. 1. Dominic Reyes. The demise of Dominic Reyes is something that will be studied by historians for years to come. Entering the UFC undefeated, Reyes quickly turned heads and climbed the light heavyweight ranks. He was a breath of fresh air in a division that had been dominated by one man for so long and legitimately positioned himself as a genuine threat to the reign of Jon Jones. Unlike so many others, he performed extremely well under the brightest lights and gave Jones one of the toughest fights of his career. Their showdown is remembered for its controversy, with many analysts and fans convinced that Reyes had done enough to dethrone the GOAT. But the judges saw it differently, awarding Jones a decision that remains debated to this day. However, Reyes was granted an unlikely shot at redemption when Jones announced his intention to move up to heavyweight. With the belt vacated, Reyes got his second straight title shot, this time against Jan Blachowicz. Many saw this as some sort of poetic justice and expected Reyes to dominate the division after Jones' exit. However, things couldn't have gone worse for him. He was violently knocked out by Blachowicz, and that's where things started to spiral. Next came one of the scariest knockouts you'll ever see at the hands, or should I say elbows, of Yuri Prochazka. But the blows didn't stop there. In his most recent fight against Ryan Spann, Reyes found himself out cold on the canvas once again. It's crazy to think how high our hopes for Dom were and how far he's fallen since coming closer than anyone ever has to beating Jon Jones. And that's why he's the number 1 on our list of the biggest disappointments in UFC history. If you like this list, be sure to check out our official UFC BMF rankings.